Today we are going to unpack the historical fiction, The Personal Librarian. Now, if you are new, let me introduce myself. I'm Olive, and this is Olive's Thoughts on Books. If you are a return viewer, welcome back.
Okay, well, take it away, Olive.
Before we talk about the book, I want to make a somewhat controversial statement, which I will flesh out later, about the actual historical woman, Belle Marion Greener, who evolved into Belle DaCosta Green.
She is intriguing, is she not?
Now back to the book discussion on The Personal Librarian. This is about Belle's life as a librarian, and I mean capital L librarian. She started at Princeton and then moved to J.P. Morgan's library as his personal librarian. She may have been passing as white, but there was nothing fake about her expertise and love of historical manuscripts and art.
I am a librarian.
Now, this book is written from Belle's perspective. We hear her inner dialogue as she is constantly self-assessing to ensure that she is circumspect in every nuance of her external presentation.
Our standards have to be higher than anyone else's because we are the standard for everybody else.
We also get a glimpse into the pressure she was under to be the sole provider for her family. You can actually feel the weight on her shoulders that the success of her passing white will impact her family. If she is outed, they will be outed. And just to add a little bit more pressure, both her mother and J.P. Morgan let her know you cannot afford to make a mistake.
No pressure.
And then we also find out how limiting this choice is for Belle in her relationships. She can only allow herself to have dalliances. She has one experience of true love with Bernard Berenson, but it doesn't turn out well. So what is this somewhat controversial statement? It is that I do not believe that Belle DaCosta Green's story is primarily about passing as white. So when I first started learning about Belle, I thought of the line originally that was written about Marie Curie. She died a famous woman denying her wounds. Denying her wounds came from the same source as her power. And that was written by Adrienne Rich, The Dream of a Common Language. So have you ever felt like you had to hide part of yourself or become someone else to fit in? I know I struggled a lot in my 20s and 30s because of my ADHD. It seemed like everybody had their life together and I just could not get it together. And I put on a smile and acted like everything was great, but I felt like my life was a total train wreck. So things have gotten better since then, but who knows? Maybe you guys have experienced something like that. If so, if you feel comfortable, put it in the comments.
Oh, being normal is vastly overrated.
Now, before I share my thoughts on why I think that Belle's story is not primarily about a woman passing as white, let's talk about Belle's background and her time in history. We need to keep in mind that Belle lived her adult life in the early 1900s. Women were still fighting for the right to vote. A woman's role, black or white, was very well entrenched in society at the time. To be pure until married, find a husband, get married, have children, and tend to home and hearth.
Sounds like a blast.
So how did Belle do it? How did she hurdle past these gender and racial roadblocks? We know that Belle was born with a mixed race heritage and into an elite Black family in Washington, D.C. Her family was in the top echelon of Black society. Her father, Richard Greener, was well known. He was the first African American to graduate from Harvard College and then became the dean of the Howard Law School. All of Belle's siblings were college educated. And we know that Belle's mother decided that all her family would pass as white and move them all to New York City. So that paints a very good picture of Belle, how she grew up and how she was able to kind of hurdle over all these barriers. Belle was very well educated. She was brilliant. She was well spoken. She was self disciplined, perceptive, tenacious, daring, and audacious.
Oh, she sounds very grand.
Now I want you to imagine and place yourself in that time and space, in the societal confines that would put any woman, especially a Black woman, well outside of this sphere of influence and prestige. J.P. Morgan may have been consumed with greed and power, but he was not stupid. He did not tolerate any kind of shenanigans.
You must tell me if there are any shenanigans whatsoever.
And out of a sea of librarians that would have sold their souls to be J.P. Morgan's personal librarian, he picked her. Obviously, he knew. He knew she was passing his way, and he didn't care.
You knew? I knew.
We're coming down to it. Why didn't he care when reputation was everything in the Gilded Age? Also take into account that the correspondence between whites during that time who were associated with her, they knew she wasn't white. So why didn't they out her? Why didn't they out her publicly? It was because of who she worked for. It was because of who backed her. So in other words, if J.P. Morgan only hires whites, then Belle is white, no matter what she looks like. And no one dared to say anything opposite that, especially not in public. So I feel that Belle was able to safely pass as white due to the privilege that J.P. Morgan had due to his great wealth and power. From a spiritual lens, I feel that every human story points back to God's goodness or is an allegory for God's love and care. So in this case, in Belle's story, in her life story, we may feel inadequate like Belle does. We may feel like we need to hide or be something that we're not. But God, like J.P. Morgan, his wealth and power has no end. Of course, J.P. Morgan's did, but at that time it seemed like it didn't. And in the same way that J.P. Morgan still hired Belle, God sees us, he knows us, he knows the struggles that we have, and he still picks us for a personal relationship.
Well, that's good news.
So I am in no way, and I want to be very clear about this, I am in no way diminishing the obvious evil that had been perpetrated at the time to undermine the Reconstructionist laws and intentions, which led to Genevieve Greener's decision to have her family pass as white. I know that from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to 1877, the goals of the Reconstruction were thus: to bring the Southern states back into the Union under the following guarantees: permanent ban of slavery, guaranteeing due process and equal protection rights to former slaves, and the guarantee that all males be given the ability to vote, despite their race, their color, or their previous condition.
That's a good start.
Unfortunately, Reconstruction failed. Well, not really. It didn't fail, it unraveled. It was actually undermined and sabotaged. There were many major players in this demise. The Northern Democrats, the Ku Klux Klan, a downturn in the economy, and also the introduction of the really exploitive system of sharecropping that spread all along the South.
So that's a little history lesson for you.
So even though we can point to all these different players that tried to undo the Reconstruction efforts, from a spiritual lens, we know the author of all things that are manipulative, that divide people, that cause human suffering, and that is Satan. He is a keen and long-term observer of human weaknesses, and he will use evil men, or evil men will allow him to use them to spread lies, to manipulate, to invoke fear, to intimidate, to coerce, and even worse.
We need to stay vigilant.
Belle's situation is far from unique. Many people throughout history have had to take measures and hide who they were, in order to survive. Here are a few books that delve into that subject more. If you're interested, I'll have those also listed in the description. So let's talk about the theme. We know Belle's life story is a narrative where defying norms become a legacy of empowerment. Whether you agree with Belle's decision to pass as white, this book will have you question when or if it is appropriate to resist social expectations that limit individual potential. I enjoyed this book, but it left me wanting. It seemed to me that it just stayed on the fence too much between historical fiction or just history. It didn't really do either well, and so I'm just going to give this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. But I want to know your thoughts on the book. Have you read it? What do you think about the book? Or if you haven't read it, what do you think about Belle's life and the things that she was able to accomplish as J.P. Morgan's personal librarian? Now, if you don't know anything about Belle DaCosta Green, then this book is a perfect place to start. But I would also suggest to really get a more well-rounded accounting of her life, that you check out some of these resources, and I will also have them in the description. Now, a quick check-in for my 52 Book Club Challenge enthusiasts. We are ticking off about finding identity with the personal librarian. What challenge prompts are you conquering this month? Let me know. I'm always open to new ideas. Well, that's a wrap on the personal librarian. If you want to continue with me on these literary adventures, subscribe, hit the like, and hit the bell. Happy reading, and stay wonderfully bookish.